The Development of Personality, 284. In somewhat free-handed fashion, the last two lines of Goethe's stanza are often quoted. The highest bliss on earth shall be the joys of personality. This gives expression to the view that the ultimate aim and strongest desire of all mankind is to develop that funnels of life which is called personality. Nowadays, personality training has become an educational ideal that turns its back upon the standardized, mass-produced, normal human being demanded by the machine age. It thus pays tribute to the historical fact that the great liberating deeds of world history have sprung from leading personalities and never from the inert mass, which at all times secondary and can only be prodded into activity by the demagogue. The hussars of the Italian nation go forth to the personality of the duce, and the dirges of other nations lament the absence of strong leaders. The yearning for personality has therefore become a real problem that occupies many minds today, whereas in former times there was only one man who had a glimmering of this question, Friedrich Schiller, whose letters on aesthetic education have lain dormant, like a sleeping beauty of literature for more than a century. We may confidently assert that the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation has not taken much notice of Schiller as an educator. On the other hand, the furor tectonics had huddled itself upon pedagogics in the strict sense of the education of children, delved into child psychology, ferreted out the infantilism of the adult, and made of childhood such a portentous condition of life and human fate that it completely overshadows the creative meaning and potentialities of adult existence. Our age has been extravagantly praised as the century of the child. This boundless expansion of the kindergarten amounts to complete forgetfulness of the problems of adult education divined by the genius of Schiller. Nobody will deny or underestimate the importance of childhood. The severe and often lifelong injuries caused by stupid upbringing at our modern school are too obvious, and the need for more reasonable pedagogic methods is far too urgent. But if this evil is to be attacked at the root, one must in all seriousness face the question of how such idiotic and bigoted methods of education ever came to be employed and still are employed. Obviously, for the sole reason that there are half-baked educators who are not human beings at all, but walking personifications of method. Anyone who wants to educate must himself be educated. But the parrot-like book learning and mechanical use of methods that is still practiced today is no education either for the child or for the educator. People are everlastingly saying that the child's personality must be trained. While I admire this lofty ideal, I can't help asking who it is that trains the personality. In the first and foremost place, we have the parents, ordinary, incompetent folk, who more often than not are half children themselves and remain so all their lives. How could anyone expect all these ordinary parents to be personalities? And who has ever given a thought to devising methods for inculcating personality into them? Naturally then, we expect great things of the pedagogue, of the trained professional who, heaven help us, has been stuffed full of psychology and is bursting with ill-assorted views and as to how the child is supposed to be constituted and how he ought to be handled. It is presumed that the useful persons who have picked on education as a career are themselves educated. But nobody, I dare say, will ever to assert that they are all personalities as well. By and large, they suffer from the same defective education as the helpless children they are supposed to instruct, and as a rule, are little personalities at their charges. Our whole educational problem suffers from a one-sided approach to the child who is educated, and from an equally one-sided lack of emphasis on the uneducatedness of the educator. Everyone who has finished his course of studies feels himself to be fully educated. In a word, he feels grown up. He must feel this. He must have the solid conviction of his own competence in order to survive the struggle for existence. Any doubt or feeling of uncertainty would hinder and cripple him, undermining the necessary faith in his own authority and unfitting him for a professional career. People expect him to be efficient and good at his job and not have doubts about himself and his capabilities. The professional man is irretrievably condemned to be competent. 285. Everyone knows that these conditions are not ideal, but with reservations we can say that they are the best possible under the circumstances. We cannot imagine how they could be different. We cannot expect more from the average educator than from the average parent. If he is good at his job, we have to be content with that. Just as we have to be content with parents bringing up their children as best they can. 286. The fact that the high ideal of educating the personality is not for children, for what is usually meant by personality, a well-rounded psychic whole that is capable of resistance and abounding in energy, is an adult ideal. It is only in an age like ours, when the individual is unconscious of the problems of adult life, or what is worse, when he consciously shirks them, that people could wish to foist this ideal onto childhood. I suspect our contemporary pedagogical and psychological enthusiasm for the child of dishonorable intentions. We talk about the child, but we should mean the child in the adult. For in every adult there lurks a child, an eternal child, something that is always becoming, is never completed, and calls for unceasing care, attention, and education. That is the part of human personality which wants to develop and become whole. But the man of today is far indeed from this wholeness. Dimly suspecting his own deficiencies, he seizes upon child education and fervently devotes himself to child psychology, fondly supposing that something must have gone wrong in his own upbringing and childhood development that can be weeded out in the next generation. This intention is highly commendable, but comes to grief on the psychological fact that we cannot correct in a child a fault that we ourselves still commit. Children are not half as stupid as we imagine. They notice only too well that is genuine and what is not. Hans Andersen's story of the Emperor's Clothes contains a perennial truth. How many parents have come to me with the laudable intention of sparing their children to the unhappy experiences they had to go through in their own childhood. And when I ask, "Are you quite sure you have overcome these mistakes yourself?" they are firmly convinced that the damage has long since been repaired. In actual fact, it is not. If, as children, they were brought up too strictly, then they spoil their own children with a tolerance bordering on bad taste. If certain matters were painfully concealed from them in childhood, these are revealed with a lack of reticence that is just as painful. They have merely gone to the opposite extreme, the strongest evidence for the tragic survival of the old sin, a fact which has altogether escaped them. 287. If there is anything that we wish to change in our children, we should first examine it and see whether it is not something that could better be changed in ourselves. Take our enthusiasm for pedagogics. It may be that the boot is on the other leg. It may be that we misplace the pedagogical need because it would be an uncomfortable reminder that we ourselves are still children in many respects and still need a vast amount of educating. 288. At any rate, this doubt seems to me to be extremely pertinent when we set out to train our children's personalities. Personality is seed that can only develop by slow stages throughout life. There is no personality without definiteness, wholeness, and ripeness. These three qualities cannot and should not be expected of the child, as they would rob it of childhood. It would be nothing but an abortion, a premature pseudo-adult. Yet, our modern education has already given birth to such monsters, particularly in those cases where parents set themselves the fanatical task of always doing their best for the children and living only for them. This clement ideal effectively prevents the parents from doing anything about their own development and allows them to thrust their best down their children's throats. This so-called best turns out to be the very thing the parents have most badly neglected in themselves. In this way, the children are goaded on to achieve their parents' most dismal failures and are loaded with ambitions that are never fulfilled. Such methods and ideals only engender educational monstrosities. 289. No one can train the personality unless he has it himself. And it is not the child, but only the adult who can achieve personality as the fruit of a full life directed to this end. The achievement of personality means nothing less than the optimum development of the whole individual human being. It is impossible to foresee the endless variety of conditions that have to be fulfilled. A whole lifetime in all its biological, social, and spiritual aspects is needed. Personality in the supreme realization of the innate idiosyncrasy of a living being. It is an act of high courage flung in the face of life, the absolute affirmation of all that constitutes the individual, the most successful adaptation to the universal condition of existence coupled with the greatest possible freedom for self-determination. To educate a man to this seems to me no light matter. It is absolutely the hardest task for the modern mind has itself. And it is dangerous too. Dangerous to a degree that Schiller has never imagined, though his prophetic insight made him the first to venture upon these problems. It is as dangerous as the bold and hazardous undertaking of nature to let women bear children? Would it not be sacrilege, a Promethean or even Luciferian act of presumption, if a superhuman ventured to grow an homunculus in a bottle and then found it sprouting into a golem? And yet he would not be doing anything that nature does not do every day. There is no human horror or fairground freak that has not lain in the womb of a loving mother. As the sun shines upon the just and the unjust, and the women who bear and give suck tend God's children and the devil's brood with equal compassion, unconcerned about the possible consequences. So we also are part and parcel of this amazing nature, and like it, carry within us the seeds of the unpredictable. 290. Our personality develops in the course of our life from the germs that are hard or impossible to discern. And it is only our deeds that reveal who we are. We are like the sun, which nourishes the life of the earth and brings forth every kind of strange, wonderful, and evil thing. We are like the monsters who bear in their wombs untold happenings and suffering. At first, we do not know what deeds or misdeeds, what destiny, what good and evil we have in us. And only the autumn can show what the spring has engendered. Only in the evening will it be seen what the morning began. 291. Personality, as the complete realization of our whole being, is an unattainable ideal. But unattainability is no argument against the ideal, for ideals are only signposts, never the goal. 292. Just as the child must develop in order to be educated, so the personality must begin to sprout before it can be trained. And this is where the danger begins. For we are handling something unpredictable. We do not know how and in what direction the budding personality will develop. And we have learned enough of nature and the world to be somewhat chary of both. On top of that, we were brought up in the Christian belief that human nature is intrinsically evil. But even those who no longer adhere to the Christian teaching are by nature mistrustful and not a little frightened of the possibilities lurking in the subterranean chambers of their being. Even enlightened psychologists like Freud give us an extremely unpleasant picture of what lies slumbering in the depths of the human psyche. So it is rather a blood venture to put in a good word for the development of personality. Human nature, however, is full of the strangest contradictions. We praise the sanctity of motherhood, yet would never dream of holding it responsible for all the human monsters, the homicidal maniacs, dangerous lunatics, epileptics, idiots, and cripples of every description who are born every day. At the same time, we are tortured with doubts when it comes to allowing the free development of personality. Anything might happen then, people say. Or they dish up the old, feeble-minded objection to individualism. But individualism is not and never has been a natural development. It is nothing but an unnatural usurpation, a freakish, impertinent pose that proves its hollowness by crumpling up before the least obstacle. What we have in mind is something very different. 293. Clearly, no one develops his personality because somebody tells him that it would be useful or advisable to do so. Nature has never yet been taken in by well-meaning advice. The only thing that moves nature is causal necessity that goes for human nature too. Without necessity, nothing budges. The human personality least of all. It is tremendously conservative, not to say torpid. Only acute necessity is able to rouse it. The developing personality obeys no caprice, no command, no insight, only brute necessity. It needs the motivating force of inner or outer fatalities. Any other development would be no better than individualism. That is why the cry of individualism is a cheap insult when flung at the natural development of personality. 294. The words "many are called but few are chosen" are singularly appropriate here. For the development of personality from the germ state to full consciousness is at once a charisma and curse, because it is first fruit in the conscious and unavoidable segregation of the single individual from the undifferentiated and unconscious herd. This means isolation. There is no more comforting word for it. Neither family, nor society, nor position can save him from this fate, nor yet the most successful adaptation to his environment, however smoothly he fits in. The development of personality is a favor that must be paid for dearly. But the people who walk most loudly about developing their personalities are the very ones who are least mindful of the results, which are such as to frighten away all weaker spirits. 295. Yet the development of personality means more than just the fear of hatching forth monsters or of isolation. It also means fidelity to the law of one's own being. 296. For the word fidelity, I should prefer in this context the Greek word used in the New Testament, pistis, which is erroneously translated faith. It really means trust, trustful loyalty. Fidelity to the law of one's own being is a trust in this law, a loyal perseverance and confident hope. In short, an attitude such as religious men should have towards God. It can now be seen how pertinent is the dilemma that emerges from behind our problem. Personality can never develop unless the individual chooses his own way, consciously and with moral deliberation. Not only the causal motive, necessity, but conscious moral decision must lend its strength to the process of building the personality. If the first is lacking, then the alleged development is a mere acrobatics of the will. If the second, it will get stuck in an unconscious automatism. But a man can make a moral decision to go his own way only if he holds that way to be the best. If any other way were held to be better, then he would live and develop that other personality instead of his own. The other ways are conventionalities of a moral, social, political, philosophical, and religious nature. The fact that the conventions always flourish in one form or another only proves that the vast majority of mankind do not choose their own way but convention, and consequently develop not themselves but a method and a collective mode of life at the cost of their own wholeness. 297. Just as the psychic and social life of mankind at the primitive level is exclusively a group life, with a high degree of unconsciousness among the individuals composing it, so the historical process of development that comes afterwards is in the main collective and will doubtless remain so. That is why I believe convention to be a collective necessity. It is a stopgap and not an ideal either in the moral or in the religious sense, for submission to it is always means renouncing one's wholeness and running away from the final consequences of one's own being. 298. To develop one's own personality is indeed an unpopular undertaking, a deviation that is highly uncongenital to the herd, and an eccentricity smelling of the Cenobite, as it seems to the outsider. Small wonder, then, that from earliest times only the chosen few have embarked upon this strange adventure. Had they all been fools, we could safely dismiss them as idioti, mentally private persons, who have no claim on our interest. But unfortunately, these personalities are as a rule the legendary heroes of mankind. The very ones who are looked up to, loved and worshipped, the true sons of God, whose names perish not. They are the flower and the fruit, the ever fertile seeds of the tree of humanity. This allusion to historical personalities makes it abundantly clear why the development of personality is an ideal, and why the cry of individualism is an insult. Their greatness has never lain in their abject submission to convention, but on the contrary, in their deliverance from convention. They towered up like mountain peaks above the mass that still clung to its collective fears, its beliefs, laws, and systems, and boldly chose their own way. To the man in the street, it has always seemed miraculous that anyone should turn aside from the beaten track with its own destinations and strike out on the steep and narrow path leading into the unknown. Hence it was always believed that such a man, if not actually crazy, was possessed by a demon or a god. For the miracle of a man being able to act otherwise than as humanity has always acted could only be explained by the gift of demonic power and divine spirit. How could anyone but a god counterbalance the dead weight of humanity in the mass with its everlasting convention and habit? From the beginning, therefore, the heroes were endowed with godlike attributes. According to the Nordic view, they had snake's eyes, and there was something peculiar about their birth or descent. Certain heroes of ancient Greece were snake-souled, others had a personal demon, were magicians or the elect of God. All these attributes, which could be multiplied at will, show that for the ordinary man, the outstanding personality is something supernatural, a phenomenon that can only be explained by the intervention of some demonic factor. 299. What is it in the end that induces a man to go his own way and to rise out of unconscious identity with the mass as out of a swathing mist. Not necessity, for necessity comes to many, and they all take refuge in convention. Not moral decision, for 9 times out of 10 we decide for convention likewise. What is it, then, that inexorably tips the scales in favor of the extraordinary? 300. It is what is commonly called vocation, an irrational factor that destines a man to emancipate himself from the herd and from its well-worn path. True personality is always a vocation and puts its trust in it as in God, despite its being, as the ordinary man would say, only a personal feeling. But vocation acts like a law of God from which there is no escape. The fact that a man who goes his own way ends in ruin means nothing to one who has a vocation. He must obey his own law, as if it were a daemon whispering to him of new and wonderful path. Anyone with a vocation hears the voice of the inner man he is called. And that is why the legends say that he possesses a private daemon who counsels him and whose mandates he must obey. The best known example of this is Faust, and an historical instance is provided by the daemon of Socrates. Primitive medicine men have their snake spirits, and Aesculapius, the tutelary patron of physicians, has for his emblem the serpent of Epidaurus. He also had, as his private daemon, the Kabir Telesphorus, who is said to have dictated or inspired his medical prescriptions. 301. The original meaning of to have a vocation is to be addressed by a voice. The clearest examples of this are to be found in the avowals of the Old Testament prophets. That it is not just a quaint, old-fashioned way of speaking is proved by the confessions of historical personalities such as Goethe and Napoleon. To mention only 2 familiar examples who made no secret of their feeling of vocation. 302. Vocation, or the feeling of it, is not, however, the prerogative of great personalities. It is also appropriate to the small ones, all the way down to the midget personalities. But as the size decreases, the voice becomes more and more muffled and unconscious. It is as if the voice of the daemon within were moving further and further off, and spoke more rarely and more indistinctly. The smaller the personality, the dimmer and more unconscious it becomes, until finally it merges undistinguishably with the surrounding society, thus surrendering it its own wholeness and dissolving into the wholeness of the group. In the place of the inner voice, there is the voice of the group, with its conventions, and vocation is replaced by the collective necessities. But even in this unconscious social condition, there are not a few who are called awake by the summons of the voice, whereupon they are at once set apart of the others, feeling themselves confronted with a problem about which the others know nothing. In most cases, it is impossible to explain to the others what has happened, for any understanding is walled off by impenetrable prejudices. "You are no different from anybody else," they will chorus, or "there is no such thing," and even if there is such thing, it is immediately branded as morbid and most unseemly. For it is a monstrous presumption to suppose anything of that sort could be of the slightest significance. It is purely psychological. This last objection is extremely popular nowadays. It stems from a curious underestimation of anything psychic, which people apparently regard as personal, arbitrary, and therefore completely futile. And this, paradoxically enough, despite their enthusiasm for psychology. The unconscious, after all, is nothing but fantasy. We merely imagined, and so on, etc. People think themselves magicians who can conjure the psyche hither and thither and fashion it to suit their moods. They deny that what strikes them as inconvenient, sublimate anything nasty, explain away their phobias, correct their faults, and feel in the end that they have arranged everything beautifully. In the meantime, they have forgotten the essential point, which is that only the tiniest fraction of the psyche is identical with the conscious mind and its box of magic tricks, while for much the greater part it is sheer unconscious fact, hard and immitigable as granite, immovable, inaccessible, yet ready at any time to come crashing down upon at the behest of unseen powers. The gigantic catastrophes that threaten us today are not elemental happenings of a physical or biological order, but psychic events. To a quiet, terrifying degree, we are threatened by wars and revolutions which are nothing other than psychic epidemics. At any moment, several millions of human beings may be smitten with a new madness, and then we shall have another world war or devastating revolution. Instead of being at the mere mercy of wild beasts, earthquakes, landslides, and inundations, modern man is battered by the elemental forces of his own psyche. This is the world power that vastly exceeds all other powers on earth. The age of Enlightenment, which stripped nature and human institutions of gods, overlooked the god of terror, who dwells in the human soul. If anywhere, fear of God is justified in face of the overwhelming supremacy of the psychic. (303) But all this is so much abstraction. Everyone knows that the intellect, that clever jackknappers, can put it in this way or any other way he pleases. It is a very different thing when the psyche as an objective fact, hard as granite and heavy as lead, confronts a man as an inner experience and addresses him in an audible voice, saying, "This is what will and must be." Then he feels himself cold, just as the group does when there is a war on, or a revolution, or any other madness. It is not for nothing that our age calls for the Redeemer personality, for the one who can emancipate himself from the inescapable grip of the collective and save at least his own soul, who lights a beacon of hope for others, proclaiming that here is at least one man who has succeeded in extricating himself from that fatal identity with the group psyche. For the group, because of its unconsciousness, has no freedom of choice, and so psychic activity runs on it like an uncontrolled law of nature. There is thus There is thus set going a chain reaction that comes to a stop only in catastrophe. The people always long for a hero, a slayer of dragons, when they feel the danger of psychic forces. Hence the cry for personality. 304. But what has the individual personality to do with the plight of the many? In the first place, he is part of the people as a whole, and is as much at the mercy of the power that moves the whole as anybody else. The only thing that distinguishes him from all the others is his vocation. He has been called by that all-powerful, all-tyrannizing psychic necessity that is his own and his people's affliction. If he hearkens to the voice, he is at once set apart and isolated, as he has resolved to obey the law that commands him from within, his own law. Everybody will cry, but he knows better. It is the law, the vocation, for which he is destined, no more his own than the lion that fells him, although it is undoubtedly his particular lion that kills him, and not any other lion. Only in this sense he is entitled to speak of his vocation, his law. 305. With the decision to put his way above all other possible ways, he has already fulfilled the greater part of his vocation as a redeemer. He has invalidated all other ways for himself, exalting his law above convention and thus making a clean sweep of all those things that not only failed to prevent the great danger but actually accelerated it. For conventions in themselves are soulless mechanisms that can never understand more than the mere routine of life. Creative life always stands outside convention. That is why when the mere routine of life predominates in the form of convention and tradition, there is bound to be a destructive outbreak of creative energy. This outbreak is a catastrophe only when it is a mass phenomenon, but never in the individual who consciously submits to these higher powers and serves them with all his strength. The mechanism of convention keeps people unconscious, for in that state they can follow their accustomed tracks like blind brutes without the need for conscious decision. This unintended result of even the best conventions is an unavoidable, but is no less a terrible danger for that. For when new conditions arise that are not provided for under the old conventions, then just as with animals, panic is liable to break out among human beings kept unconscious by routine, and with equally unpredictable results. 306. Personality, however, does not allow itself to be seized by the panic terrors of those who are just walking to consciousness, for those who are just waking to consciousness, for it has put all its terrors behind it. It is able to cope with the changing times and has unknowingly and involuntarily become a leader. 307. All human beings are much alike, otherwise they could not succumb to the same delusion that, and the psychic substratum upon which the individual consciousness is based is universally the same. Otherwise people could never reach a common understanding. So in this sense, personality and its peculiar psychic makeup are not something absolutely unique. The uniqueness holds only for the individual nature of the personality, as it does for each and every individual. To become a personality is not the absolute prerogative of the genius, for a man may be a genius without being a personality. Insofar as every individual has the law of his life inborn in him, it is theoretically possible for any man to follow this law and so become a personality, that is, to achieve wholeness. But since life only exists in the form of living units, i.e. individuals, the law of life always tends towards the life individually lived. So, although the subjective psyche can only be conceived as the universal and uniform datum, which means that all men share the same primary psychic condition, this subjective psyche must nevertheless individuate itself if it is to express itself except through the individual human being. The only exception to this is when it seizes hold of a group, in which case it must, of its own nature, precipitate a catastrophe because it can only operate unconsciously and is not assimilated by any consciousness or assign its place among the existing conditions of life. 308. Only the man who can consciously assent to the power of the inner voice becomes a personality. But if he succumbs to it, he will be swept away by the blind flux of psychic events and destroyed. That is the great and liberating thing about any genuine personality. He voluntarily sacrifices himself to his vocation and consciously translates into his own individual reality what would only lead to ruin if it were lived unconsciously by the group. 309. One of the most shining examples of the meaning of personality that history has preserved for us in the life of Christ. In Christianity, which, be it mentioned in passing, was the only religion really persecuted by the Romans, rose up a direct opponent of the Caesarian madness that afflicted not only the emperor but every Roman as well. Civis Romanus sum. The opposition showed itself wherever the worship of Caesar clashed with Christianity. But as we know from what the evangelists tell us about the psychic development of Christ's personality, this opposition was fought out just as decisively in the soul of its founder. The story of the temptation clearly reveals the nature of the psychic power with which Jesus came into collision. It was the power-intoxicated devil of the prevailing Caesarian psychology that led him into the dire temptation in the wilderness. This devil was the objective psyche that held all the peoples of the Roman Empire under its sway, and that is why it promised Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth, as if it were trying to make a Caesar of him. Obeying the inner call of his vocation, Jesus voluntarily exposed himself to the assaults of the imperialistic madness that filled everyone, conqueror and conquered alike. In this way, he recognized the nature of the objective psyche, which had plunged the whole world into the misery and had begotten a yearning for salvation that found expression even in the pagan poets. Far from suppressing all or allowing himself to be suppressed by this psychic onslaught, he let it act on him consciously and assimilated it. Thus was world-conquering Caesarian transformed into spiritual kingship, and the Roman Empire into the universal kingdom of God that was not of his world. While the whole Jewish nation was expecting an imperialistically minded and politically active hero as a Messiah, Jesus fulfilled the messianic mission not so much for his own nation as for the whole Roman world, and pointed out to humanity the old truth that where force rules, there is no love, and where love reigns, force does not count. The religion of love was the exact psychological counterpart to the Roman devil worship of power. 310. The example of Christianity is perhaps the best illustration of my previous abstract argument. This apparently unique life became a sacred symbol because it is the psychological prototype of the only meaningful life, that is, of a life that strives for the individual realization, absolute and unconditional, for its own particular law. Well may we exclaim with Tertullian, Anima naturalite Christiana. 311. The deification of Jesus, as also of the Buddha, is not surprising, for it affords a striking example of the enormous valuation that humanity places upon these hero figures and has opposed the ideal of the personality. Though it seems at present as if the blind and destructive dominance of the meaningless collective forces would thrust the ideal of personality into the background, yet this is only a passing revolt against the dead weight of history. Once the revolutionarily unhistorical and therefore uneducated inclination of the rising generation have had their fill of tearing down tradition, new heroes will be sought and found. Even the Bolsheviks, whose radicalism leaves nothing to be desired, have embalmed Lenin and made a savior of Karl Marx. The ideal of personality is one of the ineradicable needs of the human soul. And the more unsuitable it is, the more fanatically it is sieved, the more fanatically it is defended. Indeed, the worship of Caesar was itself a misconceived cult of personality, and modern Protestantism, whose critical theology has reduced the divinity of Christ to vanishing point, has found its last refuge in the personality of Jesus. 312. Yes, this thing we call personality is a great and mysterious problem. Everything that can be said about it is curiously unsatisfactory and inadequate. And there is always a danger of the discussion losing itself in pomposity and empty chatter. The very idea of personality is in common usage so vague and ill-defined that one hardly ever finds two people who take the word in the same sense. If I put forward a more definite conception of it, I do not imagine that I have uttered the last word. I should like to regard all I say here only as a tentative attempt to approach the problem of personality without making any claim to solve it. Or rather, I should like my attempt to be regarded as a description of the psychological problems raised by the personality. All the usual explanations and nostrums of psychology are apt to fall short here, just as they do with the man of genius or the creative artist. Inferences from heredity or from environment do not quite come off. Inventing fictions about childhood so popular today ends, to put it mildly, in unreality. Explanations from necessity, he had no money, he was a sick man, etc., remain caught in externals. There is always something irrational to be added, something that simply cannot be explained. A deus ex machina or an asylum ignoratia that well-known sobriquet for God. The problem thus seems to border on the extra-human realm, which has always been known by a divine name. As you can see, I too have had to refer to the inner voice, the vocation, and define it as a powerful objective psychic factor in order to characterize the way in which it functions in the developing personality and how it appears subjectively. Mephistopheles in Faust is not personified merely because this creates a better dramatic or theatrical effect, as thought Faust were his own moralist and painted his private devil on the wall. The opening words of the dedication, "Once more you hover near me, forms and faces," are more than just an aesthetic flourish. Like the concretism of the devil, they are an admission of the objectivity of psychic experience, a whispered avowal that this was what actually happened, not because of subjective wishes or fears or personal opinions, but somehow quiet of itself. Naturally, only a numbskull thinks of ghosts, but something like a primitive numbskull seems to lurk beneath the surface of our reasonable daytime consciousness. 313. Hence, the eternal doubt whenever what appears to be the objective psyche is really objective, or whether it might not be imagination after all. But when the question at once arises, have I imagined such and such a thing on purpose, or has it been imagined by something in me? It is a similar problem to that of the neurotic who suffers from an imaginary carcinoma. He knows and has been told 100 times before that it is all imagination, and yet he asks me brokenly, "But why do I imagine such a thing? I don't want to do it." To which the answer is, the idea of the carcinoma has imagined itself in him without his knowledge and without his consent. The reason is that a psychic growth, a proliferation is taking place in his unconscious without his being able to make it conscious. In the face of this inferior activity, he feels afraid, but since he is entirely persuaded that there can be nothing in his own soul that he does not know about, he must relate his fear to a physical carcinoma which he knows does not exist. And if he should still be afraid of it, there are 100 doctors to convince him that his fear is entirely groundless. The neurosis is thus a defense against the objective, inner activity of the psyche, or an attempt to somehow dearly pay it for, to escape from the inner voice and hence from the vocation. For this growth in the objective activity for the psyche, which independently of conscious volition is trying to speak to the conscious mind through the inner voice and lead him toward wholeness. Behind the neurotic perversion is concealed his vocation, his destiny, the growth of personality, the full realization of life will that is born with the individual. It is the man without amor fati who is the neurotic. He truly has missed his vocation and never will be able to say with Cromwell, "None climbed so high as he who knoweth not whither his destiny leadeth him." 314. To the extent that a man is untrue to the law of his being and does not rise to personality, he has failed to realize his life's meaning. Fortunately, in her kindness and patience, nature never puts the fatal question as to the meaning of their lives into the mouths of most people. And where no one asks, no one need answer. 315. The neurotic sphere of carcinoma is therefore justified. It is not imagination, but the consistent expression of a psychic fact that exists in a sphere outside the consciousness, beyond the reach of his will and understanding. If he withdrew into the wilderness and listened to his inner life in solitude, he might perhaps hear that the voice has to say. But as a rule, the miseducated, civilized human being is quite incapable of perceiving the voice, which is something not guaranteed by the current shibboleth. Primitive people have a greater capacity in this respect. At least the medicine men are able, as part of their professional equipment, to talk with spirits, trees, and animals, these being in the forms in which they encounter the objective psyche or psychic non-ego. 316. Because neurosis is a development disturbance of the personality, we physicians of the soul are compelled by professional necessity to concern ourselves with the problem of personality and the inner voice, however remote it may seem to be. In practical psychotherapy, these psychic facts, which are usually so vague and have so often degenerated into empty phrases, emerge from obscurity and take visible shape. Nevertheless, it is extremely rare for this to happen spontaneously, as it did with the Old Testament prophets. Generally, the psychic conditions that have caused the disturbance have to be made conscious with considerable effort, but the contents that then come to light are wholly in accord with the inner voice and point to a predestined vocation, which, if accepted and assimilated by the conscious mind, conduces to the development of personality. 317. Just as the great personality acts upon society to liberate, to redeem, to transform, and to heal, so the birth of personality in oneself has a therapeutic effect. It is as if a river that had run to waste in sluggish side streams and marshes suddenly found its way back to its proper bed, or as if a stone lying on a germinating seed were lifted away so that the shoot could begin its natural growth. 318. The inner voice is the voice of a full life, of a wider, more comprehensive consciousness. That is why in mythology, the birth of the hero or the symbolic rebirth coincides with sunrise, for the growth of personality is synonymous with an increase of self-consciousness. For the same reason, most heroes are characterized by solar attributes, and the moment of birth of their greater personality is known as illumination. 318. The fear that most people naturally have in the inner voice is not so childish as might be supposed. The contents that rise up and confront a limited consciousness are far from harmless, and is shown by the classic example of the temptation of Christ, or the quality significant Mara episode in the Buddha legend. As a rule, they signify the specific danger to which the person concerned is liable to succumb. What the inner voice whispers to us is generally something negative, if not actually evil. This must be so, first of all, because we are usually not as unconscious of our virtues as of our vices, and then because we suffer less from the good than from the bad in us. The inner voice I have explained above makes us conscious of the evil from which the whole community is suffering, whether it is the nation or the whole human race. But it presents this evil in an individual form, so that one might at first suppose it to be only an individual characteristic. The inner voice brings the evil before us in a very tempting and convincing way in order to make us succumb. If we do not partially succumb, nothing of this apparent evil enters into us and no regeneration or healing can take place. I say apparent, though this may sound too optimistic. If we succumb completely, then the contents expressed by the inner voice act as so many devils and a catastrophe ensues. But if we can succumb only in a part, and if by self-assertion the ego can save itself from being completely swallowed, then it can assimilate the voice, and we realize that the evil was, after all, only a semblance of evil, but in reality a bringer of healing and illumination. In fact, the inner voice is a Lucifer in the strictest and most unequivocal sense of the word, and it faces people with ultimate moral decisions without which they can never achieve full consciousness and become personalities. The highest and the lowest, the best and the vilest, the truest and the most deceptive things are often blended together in the inner voice in the most baffling way, thus opening up in an abyss of confusion, falsehood, and despair. 320. It is naturally absurd for people to accuse the voice of nature, the all-sustainer and all-destroyer, of evil. If she appears inveterately evil to us, this is mainly due to the old truth that the good is always the enemy of the better. We would be foolish indeed if we did not cling to the traditional good for as long as possible. But as Faust says, whenever in this world we reach the good, we call the better all a lie, a sham. A good thing is unfortunately not a good forever, for otherwise there would be nothing better. If better is to come, good must stand aside. Therefore, Meister Eckhart says, God is not good, or else he could be better. 321. There are times in the world's history, and our own time may be one of them, when good must stand aside, so that anything destined to be better first appears in evil form. This shows how extremely dangerous it is even to touch these problems, for evil can so easily slip in on the plea that it is potentially the better. The problems of the inner voice are full of pitfalls and hidden snares, treacherous, slippery ground, as dangerous and pathless as life itself once one lets go of the railings. But he who cannot lose his life, neither shall he save it. The hero's birth and the heroic life are always threatened. The serpent sent by Hera to destroy the infant Hercules, the python that tries to strangle Apollo at birth, the massacre of the innocents, all these tell the same history. To develop the personality is a gamble, and the tragedy is that the daemon of the inner voice is at once our greatest danger and an indispensable help. It is tragic, but logical, for it is the nature of things to be so. 322. Can we therefore blame humanity and all the well-meaning shepherds of the flock and worried fathers of families if they erect the protective barriers, hold up wonder-walking images, and point out the roads that wind safely past the abyss? 323. But in the end, the hero, The leader, the savior, is one who discovers the new way to greater certainty. Everything could be left undisturbed did not the new way demand to be discovered. And did it not visit humanity with all the plagues of Egypt until it finally is discovered? The undiscovered vein within us is a living part of the psyche. Classical Chinese philosophy names this interior way Tao and likens it to a flow of water that moves irresistibly towards its goal. To rest in Tao means fulfillment, wholeness, one's destination reached, one's mission done. The beginning, the end, and perfect realization of the meaning of existence innate in all things. Personality is Tao.